What were the jobs most people had in the Bible? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the North Woods, talking about Bible topics, one small step at a time. If you thought about it for a little bit, when you started thinking about people in the Bible, big names, famous names, Moses, Paul, David, think about them. One of the things that you might think of is, what did they all do for a living? And you'll notice probably that none of them were official religious workers when God called them. Not even close. I mean, I was trying to come up with a list of how many people were official religious leaders when God called them. And we're going to talk about that today. One of the things that when you start out, like I said, thinking about the names, you start thinking about fishermen, right? Peter, Andrew, James, John, all fishermen. They didn't study for ministry. They weren't serving in the temple. They were working on a trade, hauling nets and mending equipment and, fishing. And Jesus walked up to them in the middle of a workday and said, "Follow me." Their whole life with God started as that. And then you think about tent makers. Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila, tent makers. And so the man who wrote most of the New Testament made his life building tents, making tents. He worked with leather and canvas. He had a trade, and that's how he paid for himself to keep doing it. He kept working on a trade even when he became a missionary. Manual work was not in opposition of his missionary job either. They were both activities he did at the same time. Think about tax collectors. Matthew was a tax collector, right? There was a couple other people who were publicans, which were, part of the Roman group. But Matthew was a tax collector. That made him look like a traitor. He worked for Rome. He was despised by his own community. Jesus called him too. He didn't tell him to clean up his life and then come later. He came right to his office and said, "Come now, follow me." Lydia was a seller of purple cloth. Purple dye was very expensive. It was a luxury item. And she was likely very wealthy, independent businesswoman by that, right? Jesus had her working as well. In Philippi, she was one of the first converts in Europe and immediately turned her home into a church with no formal role. She was a woman who heard the gospel and opened up her house. Dorcas was a seamstress. She was also known as Tabitha, and she was known for making clothing for the widows and poor people. And while she wasn't preaching and teaching, she was serving her community, a community that was in deep grief when she died, so much so, and Peter raised her up from the dead. And her needlework, her sewing mattered so much that God interrupted her death, right? Jesus himself was a carpenter, as was Joseph, his earthly adoptive father, a carpenter or a tradesman. Tekton is the exact word, but essentially building, crafting things. God chose a tradesman to be as how his son was going to be raised. Shepherds, we had David and Amos. We'll talk about Amos when we get to the Old Testament. But they were working in the fields, watching the sheep when David was anointed by Samuel. And that's one fascinating thing. The interesting thing is Amos, who was another sheep herder, he also was a fig farmer. And in the chapter 7 of his book, he says something kind of remarkable about it, that when the religious establishment told him to stop preaching or stop prophesying, he says, "I was not a prophet, nor a prophet's son. I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go prophesy.'" I didn't sign up for this. I had no credentials. God grabbed me out of the field and told me to go. Like I said, a couple government workers. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the Persian king, a trusted member of the royal family. Daniel was a government administrator in Babylon and Persia, working inside the pagan empire. Joseph, of many colored coats, he became the second in command of Egypt. Esther was a queen in Persia. And these weren't people, like I said, outside the system. They were working inside of the systems that were around them, and God used them right there. There were a number of other people that we think of in the Bible. Is Ruth. Ruth was an immigrant who came from Moabite, and Ruth was working doing farm agriculture essentially because she had nothing to eat. There was a servant girl in Naaman's household. We never know her name. She had no status. She was captured from her homeland as a slave. This is not like the bond servant kind, this was actual slave. And she was the one who tells Naaman about the prophet who can heal leprosy. She could have stayed silent, right? She had nothing to gain by speaking up, but she spoke up and the general was healed. And her testimony makes it into our eternal record of people in the Bible. There are many other people who have basically tradesmen in the Old Testament. And there were craftsmen whose job it was to build the tabernacle of God. They were chosen because they were excellent skilled workers, gravings, weaving, metalwork. And God is specifically said that the Spirit anointing rested on the artist and the craftsman to do their work, not just to preach, but to create something amazing. Rahab, if you think about back in Jericho, and this was an innkeeper. Sometimes she was called a prostitute. It may have been a bad translation, or it might have been that she was an innkeeper to a house of prostitution. We don't exactly know. But she hid the Israelite spies. She lied to soldiers that came looking for them, and she made a deal to protect her own family. And she shows up in the genealogy of Jesus. And when we hear about her example of faith in Hebrews 11 and in James 2, example of faith in action, every human that was measured is based into this story of God based on what they did, not who they were, not what genealogy they came from. Think about the woman at the well. She's a Samaritan. She's not even, she was kind of scorned by the nation of Israel because the Samaritans were scorned as unbelievers, wrongful believers. But she was a woman who had 5 husbands. She'd been just basically living with many different men. And Jesus met her middle of the day at a well. You can guess that you can see he probably specifically came to talk to her because nobody goes to the well in the middle of the day. Most women went in the morning. He had an appointment in his appointment book to meet up with her, and he tells her something about who she is and what living water is actually about. She goes back and talks to her whole community about this. This tells you something, that these, idea that the people who God talks to have to be a certain kind, have to be a certain nationality, have to be a certain place in life. The idea is not that at all. She became the first evangelist to an entire town with no credentials, no preparation. Her whole life led up to something that looked pretty abysmal, but instead she had a conversation with Jesus and it changed her heart. Oh, so the idea is, how many officials really were there in the Bible? So if we take a look at it, I was trying to think, like I said, I was going through this list of how many people are actually people who were set aside. Well, God set aside the 12 tribes of Israel, the Levites, to be the religious order of servants. These are going to be descendants of Aaron. They could serve as priests. And so out of the 12 tribes, one tribe was having this temple role. And even it wasn't everybody. It was inside that tribe. It was a subset of people who were actually priests. Everyone else, farmers, shepherds, merchants, soldiers, government workers, craftspeople, vineyard keepers, beekeepers, whatever you think, parents, those things that were there. 90% of the people, when we look at the nation, lived ordinary lives. And the story keeps happening through them. But when we look at Exodus 19:6, before the law was even given, it says to the whole nation, you'll be, for me, a kingdom of priests. The whole nation, every person, priesthood. Then the golden calf happened, and then the breach basically was a breach of trust. And what happened then is that a Levitical system came back where it became the descendants of Aaron. But it narrowed the line of authorized temple priest. It was small, it was restricted, and that was because this was going to be work in the temple itself. Jesus comes along, and then everything changes. There's still the structure inside of the church itself. We see Paul and others talk about apostles, elders, deacons. There was the concept of bishop, which essentially are going to be the people who lead the church itself. But it's a small group of people, and it's not the center of everything that is in Christian life. And in 1 Peter 2:9, Peter writes to ordinary believers, scattered people, and these were not going to be leaders of any kind. And he says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. That whole idea is that it's not an authorized family line anymore. Everybody is in this group now. This is what God always wanted it to be, and this was the system that is from that point forward. Now in Christ, this original structure, this original design is restored. So the big idea is when you step back and you look kind of at the whole Bible, it's an overwhelming number of people who God uses that weren't official religious workers. And like I said, I was sitting there thinking back, how many of these people were? We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But it's not even close. The people that God used is probably like 99% of them were ordinary people with ordinary jobs, living ordinary lives, and God used them. It's not to say that leaders don't matter. They have a huge impact on how churches are running and whether they're running well. The idea instead makes us think about that we have an impact. No matter who we are, we have an impact. We have an official role. We have official influence in how everything goes on, from servant girls with no name to generals to sheep herdsmen to craftsperson, people anointed by the Spirit, women at wells and seamstresses in death. God uses everybody, and he uses where they're at, what they do, how they're working. And if we removed every official religious person from the Bible, most of the work would still go on. It's very, very few people. And so we have to think about what that means for us. What does it mean for us? If we're not at ministry, we're not pastors, we're not teachers, just living my life. Sometimes it makes us feel like we don't have a role. We think, well, that's my pastor's job. I remember someone said, well, why do I have to evangelize? I teach an evangelism class at this college every year. Why do I have to evangelize? I mean, that's what I give money to the church to do. No, our money that we give to the church is not so that I can just live my life and pay the church to do all the things I'm supposed to do. We're all supposed to do them. The story of the gospel and the Bible and the spreading goes through people. It's done in the farm fields. It's done in the workshops. It's done in government offices. It's done in fishing boats. It's done in the home. It's done through parenting. Ordinary life is not a waiting room for other people to do the work of the God. Our job, our home, our neighborhood, our everyday Tuesday, our visit to the coffee shop, that is exactly what God's work in this world is about. Already doing the things that we are already a part of, but doing it faithfully and doing it. You don't need a title. You don't need anything fancy. Heck, that servant girl in the Old Testament, she didn't even have a name. So that's the idea. But we are not meant to lapse in this idea. We're not just meant to rest on our laurels because we don't have an official title and just leave it for the church people. And I have to say, this was kind of a big lesson to me. So back when I was brand new Christian, I ended up working for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And I didn't know it at the time, but a lot of people I worked with were well-known theologians. I didn't have any idea. I was a brand new Christian, so I didn't know who they were. And I learned a lot from that experience. But there was a fellow named Dr. Pete Hammond, and he had a ministry that was talking about regular people in their day-to-day jobs. And he ended up giving me this. This was called the Word and Life Study Bible. But essentially, the idea behind the study Bible was that everyone was normal people in the Bible, that the regular people doing their jobs. And we don't equip people to do this kind of work in their day-to-day jobs that we tend to think of, like I said, church officials, that they're just going to do the job. And so there's a few people that were mentioned in the Bible full-time ministry. There were some people, those are going to be the descendants of Aaron. Aaron became one partially through his life. The Levites were going to be assistants and musicians and gatekeepers as part of the temple structure. So like I said, we can think of some names like Aaron, Eleazar, Phineas, Eli, Zadok, Abiathar, Asaph. We hear his name in Psalms as a musician. We don't know much about him. But then there are some other people. Like I said, I was kind of just thinking of it in very small terms. Eventually, Timothy and Titus were called workers, so that's why we have those. There were certainly a number of apostles. There were some people that were even appointed as church members to do certain tasks. Stephen, Philip, the name goes on. Like I said, I was sitting there trying to think of all the different people that essentially were church workers. And the one guy that I could think of was John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, who, when the angel talked to him, was working inside of the temple itself, doing a job that only very few people could do. And I thought, gosh, is he the only person I could think of that had actual official church duties? But I mean, there were people who were, called as prophets like Samuel and stuff like that. But I guess I just wanted to bring out this point that the action of the gospel and the working of God's temple and his church with the message of God was done like people like you and me. We're regular people that we don't leave this to the church to do. The work that we're reading in the Gospels and we're reading in the Bible, that's for us to do, and that we should be doing it. All right, everyone, thanks so much. Appreciate you being out there and listening. If you have any comments, if you thought of someone else, like I said, Zechariah was the one guy who came into my mind. But I hope that you enjoyed this kind of look at people in the Bible and their occupations. They're just regular people, just like you and me. Thanks so much. Have a great day.